Hey everyone, Brian Kibler here, and I want to do something a little bit different today. This is sort of a idea I had for some content a little bit different than the sort of game highlights and just sort of card reviews and such that I have been doing up to this point. So if this is the sort of thing that you enjoy, be sure to let me know in the comments, and I will look into doing more of it. But today, I want to talk about Discover. The Discover mechanic was introduced in League of Explorers, and it has quickly become my favorite mechanic in Hearthstone. I think that it is both from sort of a game design level as well as from a level of the strategic and gameplay implications that it has. Just a really well designed and developed mechanic, and just from what we've seen so far, it's been a lot of fun to play with. And I'm really excited to see the new cards coming out in the final wing of League of Explorers. The reason I think Discover is such a good mechanic is because it works to encourage gameplay variety in terms of how it actually plays out. And in fact, it's funny because Discover is sort of exactly opposite Inspire. Actually, Inspire in the Grand Tournament was just a really bad mechanic. And I don't just mean that in the sense that the cards that were made with the mechanic were just not powerful or, not interesting, but I think that as sort of a mechanic to build a set around, it was just bad from a design perspective, because when Inspire is happening, when the person with the Inspire cards is doing their thing, the same thing is just sort of happening all the time in the game. It's just a very repetitive thing. You use your hero power, this thing happens. You use your hero power, this thing happens. And I think that games in which Inspire is good are generally miserable games. I've played, any number of arena games. I played very little arena, but a number of arena games where just like one player gets ahead with an Inspire minion and the game is just over because it just snowballs out of control. And well, it's sort of interesting in theory. It's like, hey, you make this thing that if you can protect it, you get a big reward. The actual gameplay involving them are just often just not really that fun. And so I think that sort of things that reinforce repetitive game states, repetitive play patterns like Inspire just aren't particularly good mechanics. But Discover is exactly the opposite. Discover is a mechanic that introduces additional variety to gameplay inherently. If you have cards with Discover in your deck, they create a variety for outcomes that can't be determined when you actually put those cards in your deck. If you play, say, a Jeweled Scarab, it's like some games, maybe you're playing Shaman and you get Lightning Storm. Maybe you get Hex. Maybe you get some minion. It provides a bunch of interesting options that causes things to happen that wouldn't normally happen during a game with a deck involving just sort of the set cards that it began the game with, that obviously don't include Discover. And that's just really cool. You end up having games that play out differently because even between the exact same deck lists, they can play out dramatically differently because of the introduction of things from Discover. I think that cards like Unstable Portal and Effigy are also cool in this way. It's one of the reasons you see sort of highlight videos on YouTube of cards like Unstable Portal, of cards like Effigy. Discover similarly creates these different and interesting scenarios where it does so, though, in a way that's very different in terms of the way that it's presented to the player, because rather than just sort of this random outcome happening from something like, say, a piloted shredder or an implosion or whatever, these things that generate scenarios that are not deterministic, which are important for Hearthstone. That's one thing. You see a lot of people sort of railing against the randomness of a lot of things in Hearthstone. In many cases, it's a case of people not really sort of recognizing just how linear that Hearthstone as a game would be if it were not for instances of randomness. Hearthstone, you can choose to keep a lot of your cards in your hand as part of the mulligan phase. That allows for more consistent things happening in the early stages of the game. You are guaranteed to get a resource every turn. You have hero powers you can use every turn. You have direct attacking, so you can choose how your minions fight every turn. So a lot of things are just based on this pretty deterministic pattern, and you need elements of randomness to break that up, or else games will just be very, very similar all the time. But Discover, I think, is the great kind of randomness compared to things like Implosion or things like Piloted Shredder, which I think are forms of randomness that really kind of bother people because they aren't things that you can really you can really leverage any kind of meaningful decision making with. It's like, yeah, you can be like, okay, I can plan for what I'm going to do if this sort of thing comes out of this, but all the decision making for those is up front. Whereas with Discover, the decision making is for one, the onus is on the player who chooses to play with it, as opposed to something like Piloted Shredder, where you just kind of have to guess what might come out and make your plays based on that. And there's always one way that you get sort of screwed over based on whatever you do. Or Implosion, it's like, well, I hope this isn't 2, or I hope his isn't roll 4. Whichever, it's not really something you can really plan for. It's something that you just kind of have to try to mitigate the bad outcomes. But with Discover, it actually provides a way that strong players can be rewarded for good decision making. And it allows for a lot of interesting situations to come up in gameplay that wouldn't come up otherwise, because the nature of Discover is such that it will often introduce cards to a game that you don't really tend to see players putting in their deck. Like I've won games with Corruption off of Dark Peddler. I've won games with any number of just really like Pyroblast off of Ethereal Conjurer. All these things, which obviously Pyroblast is a card you might put into some decks, but not most decks that aren't Freeze Mage. But it ends up allowing players to leverage their skill and decision-making process. That's this interesting kind of managed randomness, and also it creates a very interesting strategic element to the way that sort of decks line up. One thing about Hearthstone that's not really the same as a lot of other collectible games, and this is in part because of the nature of the hero powers and draw engine in Hearthstone, causing games to really, it's sort of the linear nature of a lot of the games. You often have my deck lines up against your deck. And you see this most often with Control Warrior, because the nature of Control Warrior and the cards that exist in it mean that ultimately the games go in this way, and my threats line up against your answers, and ta-da! Like we ultimately get down to the same sort of thing where both players more or less exhaust their decks. And Discover, it breaks that up. Not only does it create more interesting things because it causes players to have to play around things that are by nature unpredictable, like what sort of thing you got off your Discover on, say, a Scarab or, say, a Museum Curator. But it also creates a dynamic that is very different than you can just have a response to all of my things. One of the cards that I actually initially evaluated fairly poorly was the Archthief Rafam. And the card, I looked at it and I was like, this looks kind of like a version of Nefarian that's not necessarily much more impressive, but it costs really a huge amount to play the artifact that you discover. But sort of in reevaluating it, since my initial thoughts, I sort of realized that this is actually way better in many situations than something like Nefarian, because it puts something really powerful from outside the game into your deck that can really break up the sort of threat-answer paradigm that you see against decks like Control Warrior. And it's a really interesting card in a deck like, say, Control Mage, which is one of my favorite kinds of decks to play. And I'm really looking forward to trying that card out. Similarly, I'm really looking forward to trying out Museum Curator. I think that Museum Curator is a card that is really interesting in the context of a deck like Control Priest. Because a Priest deck, naturally, because the Priest hero power doesn't interact with the board unless you have minions, Priest tends to have to play pretty reactively in the early turns of a lot of games, or play very low impact cards like, say, Holy Smite or things like that to interact with the opposing early minions. But something like Museum Curator, it's a great card because not only does it allow you to interact with your opponent's early stuff, say kill your opponent's Leper Gnome or Abusive Sergeant or whatever else, or provide you with an early body for Valen's Chosen. But also, it's like, okay, if you're playing against a aggressive deck, you can play your Museum Curator and take something like Deathlord or Dark Cultist. Whereas you're playing against a control deck, and suddenly, instead of those, you have options like Piloted Sky Golem or Sneed's Old Shredder. So the ability to meld a game plan mid-game, once you have information about what your opponent is doing, allows these Discover cards to add this whole additional dynamic of decision-making and skill while generating this much more varied and textured gameplay experience than you really see in most areas of Hearthstone otherwise. So anyway, I think Discover's great, and I'm really happy to see the direction that Hearthstone has gone recently, and I'm really looking forward to playing with the new cards that are coming out in the last wing. So that's really it. I just wanted to share some thoughts, and yeah, let me know if this is the sort of thing you like, and I will look into doing more sort of thoughts like these in the future.
Brawl versus Malfurion. I must protect the wild.
Whoa, notice a Murloc.